Kulak 76 points out that Neil Armstrong was an Eagle Scout. One of the great things about being able to do this is I get to talk a little bit about the kind of person Neil Armstrong actually was. I thought First Man was just appalling. I just thought it was just a genuine criminal insult. But just to give you an idea about what kind of man this guy Neil Armstrong was, Kulak 76 said Neil Armstrong was an Eagle Scout. He was an Eagle Scout, but what many people don't know is that Neil Armstrong, after he came back, personally wrote a letter to every single Eagle Scout that the Boy Scouts graduated. He wrote a letter to every single one of them in his own hand, congratulating them on becoming Eagle Scouts. And he did this for years and years and years. And it wasn't until he found out that people were scamming people by forging his signature that he stopped doing it. But, I mean, think about this. This is the guy. I wouldn't say exactly the most famous guy in history, but his name will be around longer than anybody that we can think of. He wrote a personal letter to every single Eagle Scout congratulating them. That's something in there. And this is the thing I'm trying to get my fingers on working forward, is what ingredients were there and what changed. Why was that time so effective in the things that we value? And certainly the people out there, smoking dope right now don't value these same things as we do. But what changed in our culture? Here's something else you may not have known about Neil Armstrong, Kulak, who brought up the Eagle Scout thing. Armstrong got along with everybody. He never ever took credit for anything. He was always the first guy to say that this is a product of 100,000 people working in an entire nation footing the bill. But as it turns out, there may have been more, but the only one I'm aware of. As it turns out, Neil Armstrong only ended up suing one person in the course of his entire life. Anybody want to guess who that person was? Blew me away. The only person that Neil Armstrong ever went to court over regarding his status as first man on the moon. You ready for this? The person he ended up suing was his barber, because his barber was selling locks of his hair and made $3,000 off of it. And it wasn't even that so much that bothered him. It bothered him that he found out that other people were selling so-called locks of Neil Armstrong's hair and defrauding people of a lot of money. Armstrong basically said to the barber, "You made how much off of this? $3,000. A lot of money for a while there." And he said, "You are going to repay all of that. You're going to give the money back to the people who got my hair." And the guy said, "Well, I don't have it. I spent it." He said, "Well, then you can start working on it. And that's what you're going to do." And that's what he made him do. I don't want to say it's inconceivable to me. It's actually the opposite of inconceivable to me. It's how you should behave. This is what I would expect anybody to do. This is the kind of behavior I expect out of human beings. He just wouldn't tolerate it. He wouldn't. And he would give autographs until he realized that people were being defrauded out of hundreds or thousands of dollars by faking his signature. And I know that story from another amazing connection. I heard that story about Neil and the autographs when I was working on my airplane. I actually have a hard time even just saying it. I heard that story at lunch after Mike Melville, the first private citizen in space. He wasn't the first civilian, but the first private citizen in space, Mike Melville, told me that story at lunch after he helped me work on the engine on my Long Easy. He had met Neil a number of times, and he said he ended up having Neil sign something for him twice, which he volunteered to do, and that's how he found out about the whole thing, because a Neil Armstrong signature in his later years was a heck of a thing to have. So since I still have a polished draft to do on the actual Apollo 11 thing, I like talking about this stuff now. It gives me a chance to exercise some ideas and get some feedback. But and this isn't to take anything away from him, but that was Neil Armstrong. But that wasn't Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin would open a 7-Eleven if you came up with a couple $100, you know. I don't like bad mouthing Buzz, and I don't mean to be bad mouthing him. And God knows that poor man has had enough comparisons to Neil Armstrong in the course of his life. But I also know a number of people who have spent a lot of time working with Buzz Aldrin in his later years, and and he's just not the same guy at all, not even close. You know, Buzz is the kind of guy who will sign something for you if you put the $100 on the table or whatever it happens to be. And you can tell because Buzz has had a number of facelifts. The idea of Neil Armstrong getting a facelift, it's like Abraham Lincoln getting a facelift. No, Buzz has had a couple of them done, and he has that kind of, pardon the expression, he's got that kind of rocket sled look, you know. And you can see, I saw a picture of Neil, Mike Collins, and Buzz Armstrong. I guess they were talking in the White House with President Obama. And Neil looks like a man in his 80s, and Mike Collins looks like a man in his 80s, and Buzz Aldrin looks like a man in his 80s who's had his skin blasted with sandpaper to make him look like a guy who's in his 80s who had his face resurfaced. Buzz, by all accounts, was not a pleasant guy, but Buzz, Buzz, they called him Dr. Rendezvous. He could do the orbital mechanics in his head. And Buzz was also the guy. We had some problems on our first spacewalks. Nothing like Leonov's problem. He nearly was killed. But we had some disorientation. And Buzz, who was a scuba diver, just a recreational scuba diver, said, "Well, why don't we train for this?" He said, "How are you going to train for 0G?" And he said, "Why don't we do it underwater?" That was Buzz. But Buzz, you couldn't have gotten there without Buzz. But he was a completely different guy. Now, I have heard anecdotally, and I'm going to look into this because I've still got another day or two before I have to turn this thing in. But I have heard in a couple different places that Buzz was extremely driven by a father, very distant, emotionally remote father. And I have heard that basically when Buzz met his dad for the first time after landing on the moon, this can't possibly be true, but if it's not true, it's got the feel of truth to it. He met up with his dad after he'd come back from the moon, and his dad looked at him and he said, "So, second? Really?" When I was very young, I want to say I was probably 15 or 16, working at the Miami Planetarium, and Buzz came in. We had some moon rocks out in display. Buzz came in, and I shook his hand briefly. He's kind of a smaller guy. But when people were talking about Buzz, I was 14 or 15 years old, and I'd heard that he'd had enormous bouts of depression, had a serious drinking problem and stuff. It's my first real connection to these kind of adult sort of problems. I think it was my friend Phil who said, I must have said something along the lines of, wow, hey, Warp Factor, when you say yes, he did, does that mean that story's actually true? Anyway, so somebody said, I think it was Phil said, he said, "Well, Bill, what do you think? I mean, how would you feel? You've spent your entire life working towards something, and I know how much you want to go, and let's just imagine that you did that." Oh, punching. No, the punching's for sure. I saw that. How would you feel if you're 38 years old and you've landed and you've walked on the moon. What are you going to do now? I remember thinking, wow, that's a that's a question. That's a real question. What do you do when you're 39 years old and you walked on the moon? What now? I imagine life would be a bit anticlimactic after that, personally. That would be my thought about being an Apollo astronaut. But that softened the blow a little bit. Look, the great thing about Apollo, and of course there's Mike Collins, who's the enigma. I mean, he's just there's like a cardboard cutout shape where Mike Collins stands, and not just compared to Neil and Buzz either. Just in general. I could tell you a bit about Dave Scott. I could tell you about Gene Cernan. I could tell you about Jim Lovell. I could tell you about Frank Borman. But Mike Collins is just an enigma. He's just a, he's the only guy I think in the entire program that struck me as somebody who really wasn't an astronaut. They really didn't belong there. But of course, he deserved it and he earned it too, and all the rest of it. Yeah, Woody Fool mentions Brian Regan's talk about the dinner party. If you haven't seen it, Google Brian Regan, Regan. I walked on the moon. It's just make you cry funny. I did not read Carrying the Fire. I suppose I should.